Good morning. Hi there. I'm Yannicka Ratcliffe, Vice President of Urban's Housing Finance Policy Center, and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you all to the Urban Institute this morning. Before we start, a few logistical notes. We are recording this event, and the recording will be available after it's over. It is a hybrid event, so we have people here in the room and also people online. Welcome. We want to have questions from all of you, so please, if you have a question in the room, you can submit it via the QR code that's on your table. You'll also find speaker bios there, and then online you can submit your questions via the Q&A box, and also find speaker bios online. If you have any troubles accessing or viewing this event, you can contact events@urban.org, and we'd love to have you join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, right there on the screen. So with the logistics behind us, I want to thank you for joining us at the Urban Institute event exploring how housing supply innovations can advance affordable, sustainable, and resilient homeownership for households of color. This is definitely a complex set of challenges we're bringing together, and it's coming at a complex time. A lack of housing, rising home prices, rising interest rates, rising rents. These are all pushing homeownership further out of reach for many renting households, especially households of color. And then sometimes it feels like on top of that we have climate change, which seems to offer us a Hobson's choice between building more costly housing or leaving lower wealth households exposed to financial and physical risk. So tackling all these challenges is going to require innovation and intention and cooperation. Today we're going to hear from some of the innovators doing just that and how these innovations can improve a range of outcomes for households and for communities. In just a few minutes, Christopher Tyson, president of the National Community Stabilization Trust, and also, by the way, a resident of Baton Rouge who has really lived with these issues, will help us understand the implications for communities and why it is so vital to expand affordability and adapt to climate change with an equity focus, like trying to get it right this time. And then my colleague Michael Neal, an equity scholar at Urban and a principal research associate with the Housing Finance Policy Center, that's a mouthful, will set the stage with data on the current state of housing supply and the impacts of climate change that we're seeing in the market. These framing presentations will be followed by two panels. One will look at first-time homebuyers, and the second on supply of climate-resilient, affordable housing. And in each of those, we'll hear from local innovators, as well as national policymakers and intermediaries who are driving change together. As we get started, first I want to offer three guiding questions to keep in mind throughout today's discussion. First, how do we intentionally design and implement housing solutions that solve for racial inequities in our housing system? And how can we connect the dots from the things we're hearing today to that broader vision of what the future could be? And then building on that, the second question is, what is the path to scale and impact? What resources and elements of our current systems can be leveraged, and what has to change in those systems, and what has to be built new? In short, what structural challenges and opportunities need to be met? And then finally, change makers need data and evidence. And so the third question, we here at Urban are listening carefully. What data and evidence do we need to inform solutions that can advance affordability, address climate, and advance racial equity? So mind you, these are not questions for the panelists. They're more meant for all of us who are listening and who are engaged in this work as well. So now I want to thank JPMorgan Chase for supporting both this event and an important portfolio of urban research on housing. Urban has been collaborating with JPMorgan Chase for many years now to produce evidence-based insights that inform the field and the firm's philanthropy. As JPMorgan Chase has expanded its philanthropic engagement into the housing field, we're advising them and working with their grantees on how to test and scale innovative, affordable housing solutions, many of which you'll hear about today, to better serve households of color. And across Urban, we're grateful for the many ways JPMorgan Chase's support has enabled us to find new ways to contribute data-driven insights to improve policy and practice in housing and a range of other domains through our independent research, action-oriented convenings like this one, and responsive partnerships with changemakers in the field. It is now my pleasure to introduce Merceda Mortazavi from JPMorgan Chase, who will share some opening reflections. Merceda is Vice President of JPMorgan Chase's Global Philanthropy Team and is responsible for executing the firm's $400 million five-year portfolio focused on affordable housing connected to economic opportunities. Mercedes has been instrumental leader in shaping the firm's philanthropic housing strategy, and we're excited to have her here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Mercedes Mortazavi.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Yannicka, so much. As she mentioned, I'm Mercedes Mortazavi with the JP Morgan Chase Foundation. I lead our affordable housing portfolio, and I'm very, very excited to be here today. And on behalf of JP Morgan Chase, welcome and thank you for joining us. Yannicka really framed the moment of time we are in, both the headwinds and the opportunities ahead. The panel's speakers and conversations today are so important as we work together across the nonprofit, private, and public sectors to address the nation's housing challenges. At JP Morgan Chase, we're dedicated to be part of the solution by addressing the systemic and structural challenges we continue to see today. We're taking a firm-wide approach that I'd like to share a little bit about, which includes a $30 billion racial equity commitment, majority focused on increasing the supply of affordable housing and access to homeownership through our business products and services. And a couple years ago, we got a little bit more brass tacks. So through policy, research, and philanthropic investments, we announced a $400 million 5-year commitment and data-driven housing policy recommendations to improve housing stability and affordability for households of color. As part of our philanthropic commitment, we aim to push systems change, both at the local and national level. We are testing innovations that can inform a national agenda, but also going deep in cities to build out local comprehensive strategies. This includes our Housing Innovation Program in partnership with the Urban Institute. I'm thrilled that you will hear from this year's cohort today. These are leaders who are addressing the intersection of supply and climate justice through really interesting and creative models that not only will bring more affordable units online, but that increase wealth and improve health for people of color. We know that an inclusive economy in which there is equal access to opportunity is a stronger, more resilient economy. A big thank you to the Urban Institute team for the ongoing partnership and for bringing us together today. And with that, I would like to introduce Christopher Tyson, President of the National Community Stabilization Trust. I am a huge Chris Tyson fan. We are grateful to have him here today to kick us off and ground the conversation in the history of how we got here and the importance of centering neighborhoods and community in this work. So please help me welcome Chris to the stage.
Thank you, Marissa, for that beautiful introduction. It is good to be working with you again. We began working together in my previous role as the head of Build Baton Rouge, the Redevelopment Authority and Land Bank for my hometown in Louisiana's capital city. And we were thrilled to be JPMC grantees there, and we appreciate your support at NCST as well. So I look forward to working with you. I also want to thank Yannicka and the Urban team for hosting this wonderful event and allowing me to come back and be a part of yet another discussion about housing innovations. Your research and thought leadership on these issues is no doubt helping to power the conversation about homeownership and its essential role in closing the racial wealth gap. Homeownership is not only a tool, is not the only tool we must focus on to close the racial wealth gap, but it is a potent one, and one that we must continue to promote and grow the coalitions and resources dedicated to its advancement. The topic of homeownership is foundational to American culture. It reflects the seminal significance of ownership, independence, autonomy, and yes, community. To the American identity. We all want a piece of the pie, not just for ourselves, but for our families and our children and our grandchildren and generations to come. I was an undergraduate student studying architecture at Howard University in the 1990s when I first learned of the term redlining. Up until that point, I was a pretty studious high school student and young college student who considered himself fairly read in the history of race in America. At that time, structural racism was not a part of the mainstream dialogue about race in America, not that like it is now. But I was aware of the relationship between public policy and the social practices that conspire to undermine opportunity for Black folks and Latino folks and many non-white people throughout the nation's history. But I hadn't heard this term redlining yet. It was a gateway term for me. It revealed to me, as I read more and investigated more, an expansive history of the structural dimensions of racial disparities and the way they continue to define opportunity in American society. Over the next many years, as an undergraduate student and then as a graduate and law student, I nerded out on this history of how local and state and federal policymakers, real estate professionals, and everyday citizens intentionally segregated our country. I was fascinated with how race became, in many ways, the dominant organizing principle for urban development and planning in America. I suspect that everyone assembled and watching this online is now familiar with the term redlining and the history of government action that it is connected to. Let us not underestimate how significant the discussion of expanding access to homeownership for families of color is in this moment. It matters that we are all fluent in the discourse around the public policy and the economic dynamics that frame racial inequity, the racial wealth gap, and the systemic barriers that perpetuate and reproduce persistent racial disparities. We indeed have a long way to go before we reach critical mass in our efforts to correct for this history, but it is a promising sign that we live in a moment where a growing chorus recognizes the need for meaningful and decisive action. It is a promising sign that so many of you have convened today to be a part of this discussion and engage and share in how to increase homeownership for families of color, and in doing so, close the racial wealth gap. Ultimately, people own homes in communities, and those communities are specific places in cities and rural areas. They, yes, may be the byproduct of redlining and systemic discrimination, but they are so much more than that, right? They are the repositories of community history and culture. They are the places where children ride their bikes and where neighbors meet up for an evening walk. They are the starting point for a big day, and they are the destination when we're ready to shut it down and have some quiet time. They are home to real people living real lives. This topic is personal for me, for I have lived these issues in my work and in my personal life. As I considered my remarks for this convening, I reflected on the 4 years I spent leading the Redevelopment Authority in Baton Rouge. Whenever I describe what I did at Build Baton Rouge, I explained that my job was to wake up every day and devise strategies and approaches to correct for the failures of a century of racialized urbanism. In Baton Rouge, like so many cities around the country, that meant contending with rigid segregation that was the result of local decisions in many cases, leveraging federal dollars and other resources that mapped inequality onto the landscape of our city, and not only affected the people who lived in the neighborhoods marginalized by those decisions, but undermined the health and vitality of everyone in the city. Indeed, disinvested neighborhoods were the focus of my efforts, and those neighborhoods are in need of tremendous resources that they had been systemically denied for so long. They were neighborhoods of color, and in Baton Rouge, that meant predominantly Black neighborhoods on the north side of town. But they were also neighborhoods where many, many people of color owned homes. They were neighborhoods where many people of color dreamt of homeownership. Like many cities, Baton Rouge's inventory of distressed and abandoned properties were concentrated in these neighborhoods. You could spend several days driving through neighborhoods that were jack-o'-lantern patterns of vacant lots with an occasional home here and there, and those lots targets for illegal dumping and other indicia of blight. As the land bank, we were able to acquire many of these properties and hold them so that we could conduct community-led plans for their revitalization. Community members hoped that those vacant lots could be transformed into opportunities for homeownership. And indeed, we were able to support small developers, almost all of them Black and Latino, who pursued such developments. But even with all of the subsidies we could layer into these developments, we always hit the dead end of the valuation gap. It simply costs more to build and revitalize those lots than they would ultimately appraise for. Very few small developers could take that kind of risk, and so many of those lots to this day sit undeveloped. I remember taking a group of business people who were interested in bringing a grocery store to the area to solve the food desert issue that was also a problem in those neighborhoods. I remember the look on their faces as we hopped out on my ride along and I took them to this commercial property and this commercial property that we held in the land bank that were ripe for just that kind of development. And their eyes seemed to look past me down the side streets at the vacant lots and the abandonment, and I could see the interest and hope fade from their eyes. Our ability to address the issues of concentrated blight and vacancy are tied up in our ability to increase the supply of affordable homes for homeownership. And as we labor against the headwinds of the valuation gap, we can look to these neighborhoods for a real understanding of the impact that this has on communities. These headwinds, however, do not just exist in chronically disinvested and blighted neighborhoods in North Baton Rouge or in the barrio or in the Black side of town in your city. Not all homeowners of color are living in disinvested neighborhoods, yet they face specific challenges that we must reckon with. In 2020, my mother finally decided to sell our family home of 36 years. It had been 9 years since my father passed, and I was quietly waiting on her to find her way to the decision to downsize and let go of this home, which meant so much to us and was such just a sentimental part of my childhood and so many family memories. My parents purchased that home in 1984, and in doing so, we moved on up, as a lot of our cousins said, for those of you familiar with the Jeffersons reference. Our neighborhood at that time was a fairly, almost evenly integrated neighborhood. And indeed, to this day, the neighbors on two sides of us are white families who I grew up with, who were great neighbors and who were a part of that community. But in the years following our moving into this neighborhood, which itself was a destination for baby boomer Black professionals trying to grow their families and grow their lives and get a piece of the American dream, over the years, everyone who moved into that neighborhood was Black, and that was fine. We created this almost utopia where we grew up in this very supportive and vibrant and fun and safe place. Like many neighborhoods in the mid-sized cities of the South. This was a suburban subdivision in its layout, large lots with sidewalk-lined streets and a lush tree canopy that covered the streets and the homes. It was a beautiful place to grow up. It was off of a main thoroughfare that ran from downtown Baton Rouge all the way to the southernmost edge of the city. And across that thoroughfare was another neighborhood, just across the thoroughfare, right? If you mowed down all the trees and everything, you could see it. It's in your line of sight. It was a facsimile of our neighborhood, developed in the same period of time, the same style of homes, the same winding streets and layout, the same lush tree canopy covering it, except it was entirely white. It was entirely white. It's okay. I didn't know anyone. I had a few schoolmates who lived over there, but we never visited there. My parents didn't know anyone who lived in that neighborhood, and that was fine. We didn't think much of it at that time. But when it came time to sell the family home, the proceeds from which we intended to use to move my mother and downsize her for her next chapter, I was curious. I had in the back of my mind the first time I sold my home, the first home I purchased in Atlanta, Georgia, right out of college. It was a condominium. My broker, who was Black, when it was time to sell it, said, before I list, I need you to take down all of this artwork and all of these pictures and anything that references your race. And she said, and actually the people who told me to do that are my white broker friends who said, some of the people that I want to show this to aren't going to want to see this. And they may underbid you, or they may just walk away altogether. And I had this in the back of my mind, so I said, let me just pull the recent sale comps in our neighborhood to see what value we're looking at. I was dismayed, much less than I thought. Homes sitting on the market much longer than I expected. And I said, well, there are many dynamics in a real estate market. That could be attributable to many factors. We're still going to go ahead with our plan, but something told me to check that neighborhood right across the thoroughfare, the facsimile neighborhood, the same homes, the same period of architecture and development, accessing the same grocery store and the same drugstore and the same amenities on that side of town. And sure enough, there was at least a 30% premium on those home sales. They sat for much longer on the market, for much less time on the market. We were ultimately able to sell the home, and we had enough to proceed with my mother's downsizing plans. But the racial wealth gap got real for me in that moment. It was the starkest example I could find, right? The amateur data analyst in me is saying, wait, I'm holding as many variables constant as I possibly can. And yet, these disparities are persistent. We have to keep in mind the people and the places within which these issues are playing out as we do this work. It's important and necessary work, and this is protracted struggle. But we're doing the right thing by bringing others into this conversation and highlighting these issues as we face these headwinds. And let's be clear, the headwinds that we face are not just related to the legacy of racialized urbanism and residential segregation. We are working our way through these issues as we face the headwinds of climate change and its destabilizing impact for all of our neighborhoods. We are facing the macroeconomic shifts that are happening as I speak, and how that is placing challenges, particularly on affordability, for so many families who aspire to homeownership. We know that we want to build up homeownership in these legacy communities where there is a cultural fabric and a sense of place and a pride. They just need resources. But we also know that we must spread those efforts throughout the metropolis so that we can achieve our goals of desegregation. Sometimes it feels those goals are in tension. We have to be aware that we have to do both, to honor the past and what people have built up in their neighborhoods, but make sure that there are no limits to the opportunities for everyone to experience all of the metropolis. And of course, in the wake of unprecedented federal spending, infrastructure, ARPA, and so on, we have to ensure that the rush to spend these dollars, that in the rush to spend these dollars, we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And we have to take time to be intentional about tending to the issues of equity, which aren't just about putting people like me in decision-making roles, but it's about the data that comes out on the other end. It's about outcomes and results and measurable changes that we can count. It's sad that we've lost ground since the 1968 Fair Housing Act in Black homeownership. We've got to fix that. I'm so excited for the conversation that you all are going to have today. There's so much data that you're going to share and discuss. And I know we will all take this information back to our organizations and continue to do this work, take it back to local communities and to continue to do this work. And I just urge us all to keep in mind the people and the places where homeownership is happening. That's America, that's the goal, and that's who we're doing this work for. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and congrats, Urban, on such a great convening.
Good morning, everyone. Wow, that was simply amazing. I'm still very impressive. Terrific discussion of the issues. Let me introduce myself. My name is Michael Neal. I am a researcher here at the Urban Institute. And following up on what I thought was a terrific start to the day, to really talk about, again, kind of what I think is a key challenge facing the country, that of low housing or lack of housing around the country. My goal is to provide trends, provide evidence that hopefully will contribute to the discussions and the conversations that we will have throughout the rest of the day. And so with that, when I think about housing supply, I'm an economist by background, so when I think about supply, my mind naturally goes to demand. I think that the table on the left-hand side the table on the left-hand side of this slide really shows one way of thinking about demand that really raises the importance of the lack of supply. And so what we're looking at here is purchase originations, people purchasing a home, by race and ethnicity. And what you can see is that Black and Hispanic home buyers using a mortgage to buy a home continually face consistent disparities, whether that is lower income, whether that is higher loan-to-value ratios, whether that is higher mortgage rates. And we know from other data, things like lower credit scores as well. And certainly those are rooted in, I think, in historical and structural racism. But what we also see here is, in fact, that the loans that they get have smaller balances than those of white home buyers. And I think that is in part reflected in the bottom row there, indicating that they typically buy lower priced homes as a way of reaching affordability in home ownership. And so that's a way to really start to think about what we then see on the right-hand side, which is certainly a recovery in new housing supply from the depths of the Great Recession. But still, the pace remains relatively low when we take this back over a 60-year period. And that is, you can see, in part driven by what the trends taking place in the single-family market, as well as what we see in terms of manufactured home shipments. And so that's kind of a nice way to then segue into what we're seeing, say, in the single-family side, where certainly single-family, clearly from this chart, is a for-sale product, really built for home ownership largely. But the pace of construction remains below what we have seen in the early parts of the 2000s. But it's also worth pointing out here that it coincides with a lack of inventory on the existing side, given by that black line, which is month supply of single-family homes. So you have two kind of effects going on simultaneously. A lack of a recovery in terms of single-family construction and a lack of inventory of single-family homes on the existing side. And, some of the key reasons from our friends at the National Association of Home Builders, who, survey their members each year, asking questions about, what did they face in the previous year? What are their expectations in the coming year? And it's clear that cost pressures were a key challenge over 2022. Building materials prices, cost and availability of labor, and rising inflation across the economy. And turning over to what they expect to see this year, certainly higher interest rates, negative media reports, the potential for potential home buyers to delay their purchase of a home until more affordable housing conditions prevail. And so one might think that, well, given these cost pressures, we should see more construction that is construction processes that tend to be more affordable, modular, panelized, factory-built type housing. And yet this chart indicates that, in fact, the vast majority of single-family completions remain site-built. As opposed to any type of noticeable shift toward more factory building, which might produce a more affordable housing product. Again, turning back to some of the results from surveys at the NAHB, we see some of the key barriers to modular and panelized construction. Things like customer perceptions, which may reflect concerns about stigma. The lack of flexibility to meet demand is another key issue. We've certainly heard issues around finance as well. And so now kind of turning over to the multifamily side, the story is a little bit different. Certainly a strong recovery in multifamily construction, but again, largely concentrated in the for rent side. On the for sale side, the pace of construction remains low, particularly when we compare it to even the years prior to the housing boom. But again, it coincides with what we're seeing on the existing side as well. That is, the inventory of existing condos and co-ops remains low at the same time that there's little construction going on in what is typically an affordable product across most of the country. Certainly, I showed earlier manufactured housing shipments, another affordable product that which remains low relative to what we saw 15 to 20 years ago. It's worth pointing out the left-hand figure, making the case that this is typically an ownership product. When we look at occupied homes, occupied mobile homes, the majority of them are owner-occupied. However, they are concentrated across the southern region of the country, as illustrated by the right-hand figure. And so that suggests perhaps an opportunity for local jurisdictions to perhaps think about ways to revise rules that may expand this product into their markets. So we've talked about single family, we've talked about manufactured housing, we've talked about the recovery of multifamily, although it's largely concentrated on the rental side. But it's also worth pointing out that we have seen, in fact, the strongest growth over the last 20 years in home improvements, suggesting that maybe there's an opportunity to bring dilapidated homes, vacant homes, onto the market through improvements in a way that might provide additional affordable stock for homeownership. And then let me just end with, housing supply, while it's a critical challenge, is one of a number of challenges that this country faces. Another one certainly is climate change. And we have seen over the last 30 years warmer temperatures nationwide relative to what prevailed over the last century or so. And that dovetails with evidence that homeowners of color, Black and Hispanic homeowners, are more likely to live in inadequate housing. So the degree to which higher temperatures induce mold, induce flooding and other natural disasters, it will have a disproportionate effect on the type of housing that is least resilient. And that could have implications for people in communities of color especially. And so with that, I think that, or at least I hope, that this provides two dimensions along which to think about these supply challenges at the intersection of racial equity and racial wealth building. Certainly issues around affordability, but also issues around resilience. And how can we find a way to balance both of those? Thank you very much and have a good day.
Michael, thank you. And good morning, everyone. I'll welcome our panelists onto the stage. It's nice to see you all here live. I've been telling my colleagues and friends that it's fun to be back at at least somewhat in-person event, but also welcome and hello to everybody that's joining us virtually. I'm Kim Dempsey. I am with the Housing Partnership Network. I'm our EVP for Capital Markets. HPN is a 30-year-old, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, national nonprofit organization comprised of over 100 affordable housing organizations. We are a combination of developers, owners, operators, and financiers of affordable housing, both on the multifamily side and the single-family side. And I'll say a little bit more about our work in a minute. Very excited to be moderating this panel of experts to really ground some of that stark data that Michael just presented, as well as some of the specific stories and context that we heard from Chris from the lens of some of our key practitioners and policymakers here at this moment in time. So as a reminder, we're going to talk about some of the supply challenges, but also really opportunities from the perspective of our three panelists. And we're going to do that in two ways, just to get you all ready with your, hopefully, questions and comments as we finish our formal remarks. I'm first going to ask everyone to talk about the production side, right? How do we increase the volume and the velocity against the headwinds that we've all been hearing about this morning so far of new production, of new homes designed for homeownership? And then we'll come back around and say, we can't forget about the access side, right? Even if we could snap our fingers and had a sufficient number of new units today, there are significant barriers that are being faced by the families and individuals that I think all of us in this room hope to serve. So what about down payment assistance? What about appropriately structured mortgages? What about home buyer education and the like? So we'll talk about production and supply, and then we'll talk about access, both from the challenge side as well as the solution and the innovation side. And then we'll hopefully leave plenty of time for questions from all of you here with us at Urban and all of you out in the virtual world. And I will not go through everybody's bios because they are available online, and I want to go straight to the content. But I will ask each of you as you answer this first question to say a little bit about your organization, your role, and then go right into kind of some of the opportunities that you see. So we'll start with Daniel, the Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy in the White House. And why don't you tell us a little bit about some of what you are excited about, what you're working on, both on the legislative side and the administrative side, that should help us address some of these supply challenges that we're seeing.
Great. Well, it's really great to be here, great to be back at Urban, and great to be with such a great panel. Look, I think the opening presentations captured so much of what we're all thinking about and what we're thinking about at the White House as well on this issue. I'll just add very briefly to it and say that, we talk a lot about the impact of low inventory and lack of supply on making it harder for folks to break into homeownership. That's a principal problem that we know a lot about. We're also at the National Economic Council very focused on the fact that that presents real headwinds for the economy and so many of our broader goals as well. So just a few examples that we all know about. When there's not sufficient housing supply, it makes it harder for workers to live closer to good jobs. That presents headwinds for the labor market. When it's harder to find a place to live close to good transportation options, that presents headwinds for our efforts to combat climate change. So just something that runs through so much of our broader set of economic objectives in the administration, and I think a principal reason why this president has made housing supply and boosting housing supply central to our economic agenda. So what are some specific things that we are thinking about and that we can do? I'll start on the legislative front. Congress should pass the neighborhood homes tax credit. That is something that has been in our budget. We'll put out another budget on March 9th. I don't want to get ahead of that, but you shouldn't be surprised if we continue to propose that, continue to call on Congress to take action there. We've talked about this, but there are communities throughout the country where it is more expensive to build or substantially rehabilitate homes than it is possible to sell those homes, right? And so by providing a tax credit that covers that gap in the event that the home is sold to low and moderate income home buyers, we think we can really move the needle there. There's been some bipartisan support. We want to do everything we can to get that done, even in a challenging political environment. Second issue, what can we do beyond just waiting for Congress to act? Our administration put out a housing supply action plan last year that was really focused on what are the administrative actions that we can put forward in addition to our legislative agenda that really go at boosting supply generally, but also supply for home ownership in particular. So a couple things to pull out there. As more and more states and local governments around the country are making it easier to build accessory dwelling units, one thing we consistently hear is the financing often doesn't work for folks who are lower wealth, who maybe have lower credit scores, have less equity in their homes, et cetera. So one of the things that we're looking at very closely is whether FHA and other agencies in the government can take steps to incorporate future rental income in the underwriting for ADU loans, either on the acquisition side or the construction side. We think that could make a real difference. Manufactured housing, which we've talked about. Every unit of manufactured housing that is purchased as new unit is added to the supply as well. So one of the things that we discussed in our housing supply action plan, and that is there's work ongoing on in the administration right now, is Freddie Mac is looking at whether purchasing chattel loans is something that could really be part of the solution here. And so that's something that they're working on this year. And if it's approved, they'll be able to start doing in 2024. And then the last point that I'd highlight is, another part of our supply action plan was really about, what can we do to make sure more of the existing inventory is going towards owner occupants and not just large investors, as we're seeing in several parts of the country. And so FHA set the goal of 50% of mortgage notes that are secured by vacant HUD-held mortgages going to mission-driven entities that are focused on home ownership. That's something that they've already done in some of their initial note sales over the last year, but it's a place where we need to continue building on to make further progress. So those are, three big areas that we're focused on the legislative side. On the administrative side, I think we'll continue to push Congress to take action here because any substantial new dollars that go into this are going to require congressional action. But at the same time, we're going to be focused on everything we can do administratively to really move the needle on an issue that is just a substantial one for households, for folks who are looking to get into homeownership, but also for our economy as a whole.
Daniel, thank you. Let me take a minute before I move to you, Priya, to connect the last piece of policy that you mentioned to practice, because sometimes we don't always get a chance to see that, especially from the federal level to the ground. But that action that was taken by the White House at the end of 21 to significantly increase the prioritization of nonprofit purchasers of HUD-owned notes immediately set into motion a first-time collaboration that we, HPN, is very proud to be a part of with Habitat for Humanity and Hogar Hispano International. We'd never collaborated before, but it made a ton of sense now with this 50% target for nonprofits that we were consistently hearing from our networks of affiliates and members at HPN that ready cash, we've been working hard to put some, available capital together, was not always enough to quickly get access to new supply. And that this policy change or this administrative change really created a significant new opportunity for us to get a hold of more homes more quickly and get them through the foreclosure process and into the hands of responsible nonprofit owners and or directly to owner occupants. So we formed this collaboration, the three organizations. We raised equity and debt. We successfully went through 2 rounds of sales and purchased several hundred notes, which are currently going through the disposition process and then will be kind of pushed out into our network and into our affiliates. One thing I'll say is we would love for more of those sales to be directed towards homeownership disposition strategies. They're not today. Today, we are competing in the same rounds with nonprofits who are bidding that have rental strategies. And the economics of that means that we are less competitive. Bottom line, right? We're bidding less on the notes so that we can make sure that they stay affordable, particularly if they have renovation needs. And that has put us up against rental strategies that can generate more income, therefore they can outbid us. So it's something that we're having very productive conversations with HUD and others about. So we are happy about the change in the sort of focus on nonprofits, and we'd love to see it go even further to benefit our homeownership goals, our collaborative homeownership goals. But if people are interested in learning more about this community aggregators group, that's our 3 organizations that are working to take advantage of this new administrative change, please let me know. So thanks. Okay, Priya, we've already heard cost several times, and I know this is one of the things that keeps you up at night. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the headwinds that you and NHT are sort of paying close attention to on the cost side as it relates to production and development, and then some of the creative things that you all are doing and seeing to address those challenges?
Sure, happy to. I'm Priya Jayachandran. I lead National Housing Trust. For over 30 years, we've been working to create and preserve affordable, sustainable, equitable, affordable housing. We largely work through 5 levers: real estate development and ownership, lending, resident services and community engagement, energy solutions, and policy and advocacy. We're relatively small, and what we pride ourselves on is that we take a 360 approach to any problem, and that includes affordable home ownership, really trying to look at it from all angles. I will focus on the affordable development and ownership angle because I think that it's probably the most direct one for this conversation. We've been in the real estate development and ownership field for 20 to 25 years. And like a lot of our peers, most of what we have done is LIHTC rental development. I would argue that some of that is strategic, and that there is a role for affordable rental housing and subsidized housing. I think that there is absolutely a role for LIHTC in a broader housing system and a housing finance system. Some of it, I think, is not as positive a story, and I would argue it is reactive, and it is born of necessity, and that is that the low-income housing tax credit is the largest available subsidy out there for affordable housing development. And as a result, nonprofit owners like us, and even much larger ones, it is the source of equity for the projects we develop. And you go after where the resources are. And so we develop LIHTC housing because, yes, there's a good role that it plays in a larger system. Candidly, I would argue that we and our peers overdevelop LIHTC housing because it is the only game in town, and we haven't developed the balance sheets. And I would argue it goes beyond that. We haven't developed the infrastructure, all of our systems. In fact, our whole organizational model is built around LIHTC. I will tell you, as somebody who runs a nonprofit developer, LIHTC is what pays the bills. It is what pays our staff. We're hamsters on this wheel that we can't get off, that the whole system is built around. And you look at it, and there is no similar subsidy in the home ownership field. you think about how much LIHTC subsidizes, and I am not against the program, I believe in expanding it, but there's got to be a corollary on the home ownership side, and I think all of us, and I think that on the affordable rental side, we're part of the problem. We're a little culprit in sometimes defending LIHTC to the point of crowding out anything else because we're so defensive about it that I think it can be a bigger tent that we have LIHTC as part of a broader system and also home ownership and thinking about resources and subsidy. I think that there are places in the market and in the country where you see that home ownership can be developed and built at an affordable cost. And I think you're going to hear from Nick on the next panel, and I think what he and his organization are doing in Brownsville is amazing. With all due respect to Brownsville and Texas, it's a different cost dynamic here. We're based here in Washington, D.C., and we developed an affordable LIHTC project called Liberty Place Apartments. It opened last year, not far from Urban's old office at 3rd in Massachusetts, so not for the other side of the tunnel here. And it's a 60-something unit LIHTC development, really good location adjacent to jobs and transportation, grocery stores, and each unit costs $675,000. And that's DC. In California, this was just 2 years ago before interest rates had gone up. In California, it is greater than that. You're approaching $800,000. We had the benefit of the low-income housing tax credit to help us do that. We wouldn't be able to do that same development as condo development because where would we get the equity? And right now we are looking at a portfolio of units here in DC. It's a development unsubsidized rental right now, over 300 units. And we've looked at it and said, wouldn't it be great to subdivide it and deconcentrate the rental? It's a nice location, do some as affordable home ownership and some as LIHTC development to layer on it. It needs work. And I think our big challenge, even to think about LIHTC, but even more on the home ownership, is where are we going to get the financing to purchase this? All of this was going to take 4 to 5 years to cobble together, to put together a plan. The owner is not willing to make a sale contingent on some execution. They want to be paid now. So we've got to come up with the financing. And to the point made earlier, the valuation that they're expecting is based on a rental execution and the assumption of LIHTC. So if we were to do it as that affordable home ownership, we're going to have to figure that out ourselves and come to that same price. So I think that that's really the challenge, is how do we bring down that cost? I think to a certain degree on the affordable rental side, we've at least diagnosed the problem. You cannot build and keep rents affordable without subsidy. Somehow we haven't taken that memo and applied it to home ownership. You cannot build and sell at affordable home prices in expensive cost areas without a subsidy. It's basic math. And I think that it's imperative on all of us to try and fix it. I think that we are, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Our other lever is our lending, and we're excited that this spring we're going to be announcing a partnership with Amazon to support affordable home ownership in 3 markets, not surprisingly, Washington, Puget Sound, and Nashville, and providing low-cost loan capital to support affordable home ownership. We operate one of the only CDFIs in the country that supports early stage and pre-development for affordable home ownership. We're also, a second part of that partnership with Amazon is, together with Grounded Solutions Network, going to be providing grant capital support new models of affordable home ownership in those markets, including community land trusts and other models to get to that spectrum. I think the idea is to demonstrate, not unlike what Mercedes announced of JP Morgan Chase's commitment to partner with philanthropy to demonstrate new models of affordable homeownership. So I think that there are opportunities, but it's going to take federal subsidy. That's the big kahuna, just like we have on the LIHTC. And I think there is gap-filling dollars that states, corporations, the Federal Home Loan Bank, AHP programs have, and affordable rental, but they all are working in combination with LIHTC. And what's missing is a federal subsidy for affordable homeownership development.
Priya, thank you. And I appreciate how you ended on the high note after making sure that we understood exactly what some of the challenges are on the cost side. No, in all seriousness. And let me add on to the high note, actually. Without the kind of dedicated federal tax credit and subsidy that you're talking about, you're right. We're going to find ourselves in the same circumstance, sort of in a never-ending cycle. I will say that a small bright spot on the tax credit side is the way that a very small number of us, and HPN included, uses new markets tax credits for home ownership. This was actually an innovation pioneered by Habitat for Humanity many years ago. We completely adopted it, stole it, and appreciated them for it, and we exclusively at HPN use our now $120 million of allocation for home ownership. It provides an incredibly deep and flexible subsidy. That $120 million, when we fully deploy it, will probably create between 800 and 1,000 homes. Notably, none of them will be in California. So to Priya's point about we have to make some judgments, right? It's not always about scale, it's not always about volume, but we also need to ensure that we're balancing the opportunity to use an incredibly valuable and precious and rare subsidy in places where we think it actually can make a difference and demonstrate the impact of the use of tax credits for that purpose. Very few CDEs use their new markets for this purpose. Mostly you will see commercial and grocery store community facilities, all of which is great. We would love to see some of our CDE friends use at least some portion of their new markets for home ownership. And I know Nick would agree. I saw him nodding when we first started talking about it. It's an incredibly flexible subsidy. So again, if anyone's interested in learning more, I think I'm going to guess there's some folks that are listening that don't even realize new markets can be used for home ownership. And we would love to talk with you more about that. Yet it's insufficient. It's insufficient. And we always have, I don't know, 10 times the demand of any level of allocation that we ever get. So love to crowd more folks in. All right, Clemente, working in my home state of California, let's hear some of what you all are doing at NPHS right on the ground to be really creative, given all of these pressures on cost and otherwise, to generate new kinds of supply for homeownership.
And how we're navigating some of the doom and gloom in California.
Yes. Navigating and coming out the other side. Please, thank you.
So thank you very much. Clemente Arturo Mojica. I'm with Neighborhood Partnership Housing Services. We're located in Southern California, now we're east of Los Angeles in a region called the Inland Empire. So we are a family of suburbs. We cover Riverside, San Bernardino County being geographically the largest county in the nation. We are both a developer and a CDFI, so we're pretty well vertically integrated to try to take on some of the crazy stuff and help figure out ways of injecting more supply into the marketplace, right, to create more equitable home ownership. We are a NeighborWorks organization as well, so we are a NeighborWorks member through NeighborWorks America, and they've been a great partner in some of the work that we're doing. Also, Chase has been a great partner, so thank you very much. I do want to acknowledge Next Step that has taken this journey with us to help create the model that I'm going to talk about right now of using factory-built housing to create more equitable, affordable homeownership opportunities, especially for families of color. So we're in California. Cost of construction is skyrocketing. We are a small developer doing, well, I should say has already skyrocketed. We are a small developer primarily doing infill home ownership, scattered development.
So by nature of that work, we just don't have economies of scale. And we're in jurisdictions where there are a lot of blighted lots, but they're about half a mile apart from each other, maybe a mile. If we're lucky, maybe some can be within, a couple of blocks radius. And, we try to get scale and economies of scale to get cost efficiencies as much as we can, but it's not. So we had to look at alternative ways of to build. And so we started looking at factory-built technology and looking at prefabricated homes, off-site construction, manufactured homes on a permanent foundation. So we took the journey. Next step was a big partner, really showed us how the industry works, how to work with the plants, and we took this journey. And we started integrating manufactured homes on a permanent foundations. These are single-family homes, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom homes, about 1,400 to 1,500 square feet, really to cater to the low to moderate income family that we're here to serve. And we found a lot of cost efficiencies using factory-built homes as part of our infill strategy. Almost anywhere, depending on the site, anywhere between 20% savings to 30% cost savings compared to site-built construction. It's right there. That's why we're still doing it, and it's viable. However, though, so after doing 10 projects, we're like, okay, how can we take this to scale? We're a small developer, so how can we create a framework that we can offer this opportunity to other developers, homeowners that are landowners, that have space, and to achieve more scale? How can we inject? Because we know that just depending on the MPHS ecosystem, we're not going to achieve scale. So we created Homes by MPHS. So it is a full service retailership aimed at supplying to other affordable housing developers, aimed at supplying factory-built single-family homes to landowners, ADUs to homeowners that have the space, and we have a lot of that. And I'll get to that in just one second. While also trying to alleviate disparities in the marketplace, because we're talking about helping developers of color. We're talking about helping first-time homebuyers of color. We heard Chris talk about the racial wealth gap and a lot of disparities, making the access more equitable. So all that's integrated. So we're successful at a launch. We launched the platform in January. We received 150, almost to 200 inquiries. In what took us by surprise, and it shouldn't have probably, was that we knew that one of the the folks that were going to help our developers of color was the amount of interest from LMI families of color that are land rich but cash poor, wanting to develop accessory dwelling units. Right now, 90% of our clientele are LMI families, primarily of color, that don't have access to ADU financing. So if you would ask me right now, Clemente, if you had $10 million, where would you park it to yield a lot of units and start achieving scale? It would be ADU financing. So we got to figure that out. And I'll pause right there because there's more data I want to share in terms of the access to capital piece.
Okay, I love it. I love it. Thank you. Great. Well, let's talk about access then, right? And these things, of course, are not mutually exclusive. But as I said at the start, even if we had sufficient units, we would not necessarily have everyone housed that we want to have housed. So let's talk a little bit about access. How can we ensure that the families, the individuals that we want to actually have access to these homes are ready, are well financed, are well prepared to have sustainable home ownership? So let's go back to you, Daniel, and start on the policy side. What are some of the things that you all are thinking about at the White House?
Sure. And I think it is really important, even when the topic is supply, to make sure we're talking about the housing market in a holistic way that acknowledges, we need a housing finance system that is making sure we are expanding access to capital in a responsible but equitable way, that we're embedding principles of fair housing and equity in everything we're doing. So really appreciate the question. I would emphasize, I think, 3 recent things. The first is, as all of you know, we were very encouraged in the Build Back Better negotiations last year at the idea of first-generation down payment assistance really kind of breaking into the conversation. Again, we'll not get ahead of our March 9th budget, but this is an important theme for the president, making sure that folks not just who are first-time home buyers, but whose families really have been locked out of the generational wealth building that comes with homeownership have access. So stay tuned. We'll have more to say from the administration on our proposals on that front in the coming weeks. The second thing is something we've just done recently, which I want to emphasize here, which is the administration through FHA last month lowered the mortgage insurance premium for their program. That's estimated to save first-time home buyers an estimated $800 a year. It will affect hopefully around 800,000 home buyers just this year. And our view really is that that's the kind of targeted support that we need in the market right now. We all know that the FHA program in particular serves, more than 80% goes to first-time home buyers, disproportionately home buyers of color. So we're very excited about that and look forward to seeing what that does in the year ahead. And then I just, finally say, whether it's our work to put out a proposed rule, affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, AFFH as we call it, because that's hard to pronounce sometimes.
They're both hard to pronounce, let's be honest.
Or our work around reducing the bias in the appraisal process. I think everything that we are trying to do, both on the supply side and on the affordability and access side, we're trying to be intentional about incorporating principles of fair housing, incorporating principles of anti-discrimination and bias reduction. So that's a big part of I think, what any solution needs to focus on as well.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, well, appreciate the efforts on the federal side. Priya, you want to talk a little bit about how we think about the cost challenges when it comes to our actual home buyers?
Yeah, thankfully, at least with respect to the Washington, D.C. metro area, this time I'm not as doomy and gloomy. I think that D.C. in some ways is a leader in this. We have the HPAP program locally, which is a home buyer assistance, down payment assistance for income qualified home buyers. And it recently, I think last year, the mayor significantly increased the HPAP levels to make a much more significant dent in rising home prices. It's an undersubscribed program, so it's not, I think that still opportunity for identifying homeowners, qualifying them on the first mortgage. I think we also are lucky in this market to have CDFIs that are providing second mortgage assistance. I happen to be on the board of City First Enterprises, a local CDFI that's associated with a local community-owned bank that is providing second home mortgage assistance for home buyers. So I think that there are opportunities combined with banks and conventional lenders on the first mortgage side. I think another thing that we're doing at NHT is supporting community land trusts as an opportunity to think about lowering the entry point for home ownership. Community land trusts are not the only solution. Like any solution, there are pros and cons. Again, back to Nick, I know he's helped me think about some of the downsides of community land trusts, which I get. Where you don't own, and for those of you who don't know, typically community land trusts are one form of a broader context of what I'll call shared equity models, where homeowners share in the equity of the home. In a community land trust, typically the improvements are owned by the homeowner and the land is deed restricted and owned by somebody else. It has, in my mind, two primary advantages. One is that by owning just the improvements, it lowers the entry point. And two, from an affordability perspective, by virtue of that deed restriction, there's an opportunity for perpetual affordability. I think the flip side of that is that the homeowner doesn't necessarily enjoy and extract that wealth from that home ownership. And I think that that is a valid criticism. On the other hand, I think that if you're an affordability advocate, that wealth and that affordability walks out with that first homeowner, and then it's no longer affordable. So I think it's part of it is that we're trying to solve so many different things in every solution. And I think at a certain point, it's uncomfortable. You're going to have to prioritize what is your highest and best use. Are you trying to ensure permanent affordability? Are you trying to combat the racial wealth gap, which might say, let them take it out? Are you trying to lower that price point to get people in? I would say that there is research from Grounded Solutions Network that I think is compelling, that community land trust owners, something like 70% of them go on to be fee simple homeowners. So owning both the land and an improvements after that. So it allows them to get into the market, build credit history, build some equity, albeit probably less if they own the land, and then move on to a fee simple homeownership. That said, we do a lot of work with community land trusts, both locally and around the country. One of the only CDFIs that provides pre-development capital for a community land trust to go out, acquire land, and develop those community land trusts. And then our takeout is when those homes are sold, we get repaid from those home sales. And it's just one small effort to think about how do we lower that entry point and make affordable home ownership more accessible. The last thing I would add is, I think as a field, one of the challenges is lowering both, I'd say, internally, but also in the larger field, our expectations on number of units. Because a community land trust, it is not uncommon for a community land trust to be building 4 affordable homes or 5, and I'm not exaggerating. This is the scale that a lot of these organizations are building at. And it's the same amount of work to underwrite that as it is a 100 or 200 unit LIHTC development. In fact, more, because you're having to underwrite that home ownership takeout. And so I think that it's sobering, and it's trying to effectively reset the y-axis and drop a 0 of saying this is not about the number of units. It's really about the number of, how much are we moving the needle on the market.
Priya, thank you. I want to just highlight one thing in particular that you said in there, which is, I think if I could paraphrase, be clear what problem you're attempting to solve with your homeownership strategy, because that will then inform the path you take. And that, I won't speak for you in this one, I'll say, I think there's validity to thinking about both the affordability challenge as well as the wealth building challenge. And perhaps there's a perfect solution out there that will do both at the exact same time, and we could all just do that. Until someone develops that or discovers it or tells me about it, I will say that I think there is validity to kind of a multi-strategy approach to the various goals that those of us that are working hard in homeownership might have. So I think that's important to keep in mind. All right, Clemente, I know you want to talk a little bit about how your organization is working to try to increase access with a real focus on the families and the home buyers that you're serving.
And before I forget my thought, I'm really happy you brought up community land trust. Because we also, as we think about creating affordability in the marketplace, we also need to talk about, well, how do you preserve and protect that affordability as well? We're piloting in this social enterprise. There is a community land trust component. We've already done one. We already broke ground in 2 units right now that includes an ADU. So we're looking at, it's a single family off-site built home with an off-site built ADU that's going to be on a community land trust. So there's a lot of finances. We're going to just push the financing. We got already working with Next Step. We got Freddie and Fannie to, what's that word, for their variances here, to really test the financing, the access to financing for families buying factory built homes with an ADU on a community land trust. Let's see how far we get.
How complex can we make a single deal?
Yeah, and so we want to get to a point where we want to bring into the marketplace 100 units a year. That's our goal. Very ambitious. I think we can get there because we're partnering with other folks to achieve scale. The homes that we're talking about are energy efficient, combined with because I want to make sure I mention this, with a lot of healthy features as well. Where it's not, energy efficiency, the Energy Star stuff, that's not enough anymore. Families are about wellness as well and health, right? So we're putting in indoor quality monitors, eco thermostats, ventilation systems, because we want the homes that we're building in this retailership to rise to meet the wellness of families. And energy efficient, healthy homes, I think integrating those amenities, I think for LMI families is going to be beneficial. So we want to get to 100 units. When all of the folks reached out to us and said, hey, we want an ADU. Hey, we want to go ahead and put a single family home on a lot that I have. It's construction to permanent financing for developers of color. Small, underserved developers is a big gap that we need to fill. ADU financing is a big one too. Right now, we're currently partnering. There is no product for LMI families who have little equity in their homes. Again, they're land rich but cash poor, right? And they don't have the access to this type of capital. They can't cash on a refi. They don't have the accessibility that more affluent homeowners have. And by the way, and the reason I'm bringing ADU into the picture, because in California, it's one other piece of the puzzle to bring more affordable units into the marketplace. But with that said, we are working within Project Reach, led by the regulators, OCC being one of them. And they've just created a cohort of banks, federally regulated banks, to look at creating a pool of ADU financing and looking at ways that CDFIs can be a delivery for that financing. And you alluded to that, and so there's a great opportunity there. We're working with Next Step on putting capital partners together that can provide construction financing for developers that are building at lower scale, 5 to 10 units in a small subdivision. Because they tend to be traditionally underserved, and their cost of capital is a lot more expensive because they're small developments. So that's how we're trying to address this issue. And lastly, we know that from the data that we're seeing that in order to achieve scale, we got to have the policy environment that's going to help us. Especially the access to credit, the access to capital, and the policy. So, Daniel, all the work that you're doing is really going to help us move, because at the end of the day, if the families can't access down payment assistance, if they can't get first mortgage financing on a factory built home, on a community land trust, or even not on a community land trust, it's really hard to go ahead and make a factory built offsite construction more mainstream in the marketplace.
Great, thank you. I want to pick up on just a couple things here before we go to questions. We heard from Priya about her CDFI's work to finance the development, and you were talking a little bit about what more CDFIs can do. Thanks to JP Morgan Chase, we have been managing a working group of CDFIs that make mortgages for home ownership. We call it the Equitable Home Ownership Collaborative. And over the past year and a half, and these are widely varying from Cleveland Housing Network to Indianapolis Neighborhood Housing Partnership to self-help, so from the large kind of national and regional players to some of the smaller players, really getting together, acknowledging that what they do is meaningful but small, and trying to figure out what would be kind of a difference maker for their business models to help them do more mortgages faster to serve primarily first-time and home buyers of color. So we're coming up with some interesting things there that we hope we'll be able to at least pilot and test sometime soon. So stay tuned for the Equitable Homeownership Collaborative. And the other thing is, and we actually didn't touch on it much, but wanted to say just a moment something about homebuyer education. Years ago, HPN co-founded a social enterprise called Framework Homeownership. This is a completely virtual homebuyer education platform that's available for modest cost online, and it really is designed to be a soup to nuts to purchase and then post-purchase sustainability resource for home buyers, particularly those that are first time and BIPOC. So that's Framework. So again, happy to talk more about that. So with that, I think we're going to turn to questions. We'll see how this goes. Aurea, right? This should be here for me. Okay. There they are. Okay, great, thanks. Let's see.
It's incredible technology.
It's pretty good, I know. Urban's not playing. So the first question is about alternative cost-saving strategies. So I might start with Priya, because I'm going to guess it was some of your comments that might have stimulated this, but anyone can speak to it. Can the panel talk some more about non-supply focused cost savings initiatives for LMI home buyers? For example, alternatives to title insurance, mortgage insurance cancellation, and or reducing appraisal fees from appraisal waivers. Or are there others, and can these be more broadly adopted?
I actually may punt to Daniel, because I know that the administration announced last month or the prior month, HUD and the White House announced some appraisal reform programs that they're launching. I'd say, specifically, we're more involved on the supply side and then on the demand side relative to creating affordable supply.
Yeah.
Great.
I'll just say a few things. One, at the risk of repeating myself, reducing that mortgage insurance premium for FHA gets at this. I mean, that we really think that was not just something that's going to help in the near term, some folks get into home ownership, but it's really about taking a hard look at that insurance premium to ensure over the long term it's priced correctly and that we're not overpricing the insurance there. That's something that, regardless of where rates go, is going to save home buyers money. The second thing is, our appraisal work has primarily been focused on reducing bias, but we're focused on whatever we can do there, including on the fee side. So that will be a place where we'll have more to say going forward. And then I think, part of what our administration is doing now broadly is looking at this issue of junk fees, not just in housing, but broadly, these kind of fees that get added on at the last minute in all kinds of markets that are not transparent to the consumer. These fees are particularly burdensome for lower income folks who are frankly just not able to pay an additional $100 fee whenever it pops up. So we're taking a hard look at rental markets, at homeownership markets, and then of course my colleagues at the White House at markets across the economy more broadly as well.
Did you want to add anything?
I just wanted to echo that. Let's get rid of those junk fees. There's just so much junk fees. We in our shop we call them the new resort fees. It's it's what fee were they charging? How much for that appraisal, or how much to underwrite that? And when the CDFI is doing a lot of the risk mitigation and injecting the subsidy anyway, so yeah, if we can get a more reform in policy to go ahead and just reduce the cost of originating a loan, that'd be great.
Great. Okay. Thanks. So forgive me, I was going to go to a question, but I see it disappearing as I'm looking at it. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about subsidies. Can we leverage the subsidies we do have now for home ownership? Okay, so for example, using LIHTC for lease to own or expanding Section 8 for home ownership through existing authorities. For LIHTC, the question is there a consideration of a model to scale a LIHTC exit strategy following a compliance period by conversion of rental to home ownership? We know that there's some in the HPN network that are working on some interesting models for that. And then secondarily, is HUD looking to combine, streamline, and or promote to scale its existing programs for home ownership? And for example, public housing to home ownership option under Section 32 of the Housing Act. Does anyone want to start with that?
I'll just start very briefly. I mean, one of the things that HUD is looking at closely and is committed to is a kind of longer term project on reforming the home program to work better for home ownership. I think broadly we are looking at, this is a little bit more in the rental space, but it is more in the rental space, but looking across programs, looking across subsidy programs. So when we have LIHTC paired with home or LIHTC paired with something else, how do we make that work better in the rental market? It's a real challenge given the various levels of government that are often at play. We, on the rental side, did an announcement several months ago that made it easier to use the rescue plan resources paired with LIHTC. But this is an important area of kind of further work, looking closely at some of the home ownership programs in the same way.
Mm-hmm. I'll give an example. One of the projects that I and NHT is most proud of is a development here in Washington, D.C. called Meridian Manor. It was one of our first developments, And we partnered with residents, as we often do, using DC's really innovative TOPA law, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act law, which gives residents the right to match a bid on their property. I'm a huge TOPA fan, but I think honestly it's often misunderstood, and I think seen as more of a panacea than it really is. It gives residents the opportunity to match that price, but if somebody has bid a very high price based upon, as we talked earlier, execution that assumes market rents, and that price is fairly high, and matching it isn't always feasible. The best way often to match that price is to use the low-income housing tax credit. And the reality is that most tenant associations assign their rights, their development rights, their TOPA rights to a development partner. It used to be largely nonprofit. Now you see it equally for-profit. A development partner to develop the housing for them with the understanding or agreement that they could live there in perpetuity at affordable rents. So they're not owning the property, but they do have the right to perpetual affordability. And we did that. The residents of Meridian Manor back in the early 2000s assigned their rights to us. We redeveloped it as a LIHTC development. Back then, though, what we did is that Section 42, the LIHTC code, has the provision, the ROFR, the right of first refusal. And we assigned that ROFR way back then to the residents. We gave them the ROFR. Fast forward 15 years in the compliance period, the residents were able to exercise the ROFR. And they have since purchased, or they are purchasing the property from us. We are staying in as an advisor to help run a renovation because, like most buildings, after 15 years it needs work, but we will have zero ownership interest. And I think it is an example of how you can combine LIHTC with ownership, but it's a long game, and very few people want to hear about long games today. We did that in the early 2000s. There was no way, and I would argue that they weren't ready and it wasn't right for them to be the owners back then. But 15 years later, it does make sense. And we were able to create an ownership and wealth creation opportunity for them. But again, it takes a while.
It takes a while, and I think we're seeing an increasing number of our multifamily members looking at these strategies, Priya, but generally speaking, we don't have a lot of nonprofits that genuinely do both, right? So for those that have built this LIHTC financed and own this LIHTC financed housing, to then want to create home ownership strategies at that year 15 mark, it's sometimes it's new infrastructure, it's new expertise, it's new capacity to bring it into their organization. So I think there's a real desire, but sometimes some of that needs to be built or built out. Did anyone else want to say anything about kind of using existing? No. Okay, so why don't we move on to another question. Let's see. Let's talk. There's some more curiosity, Clemente, about ADUs. And maybe you could take this if you'd like to. How will Fannie, Freddie, or others finance ADUs if homeowners don't want to rent them out? Many LMI homeowners use ADUs as multi-generational wealth housing rather than to rent. Do you have a thought about kind of in practice how that works, and then sort of
Yeah, no, actually that is something that we're tackling with NextStep and some of our partners. Fannie and Freddie are really not doing much in that space, but there's momentum. There's policy work, stuff happening right now. Interestingly enough, the majority of the families that are coming to us for ADUs are not for rental. They are to house an extended family. It's a necessity. Mm-hmm. So unlike the upper income folks that are looking at as a wealth building opportunity and rental income opportunity, the families that are coming to us are not looking at it to rent out, instead to extend a parent aging in place, college student, in-laws, the babysitter, you name it. It is because our families in our neighborhoods, they're doubling up, tripling up. And ADU is another way to just create another affordable unit. So more work to be done on the Fannie and Freddie space because, as everybody knows, that buying a home with an ADU, and the ADU is not adding an enough appraised value to the home, as we know, is causing some issues on the first mortgage financing piece.
Great, thanks.
If I can
Yeah,
add,
please.
Kim, I'd say ADUs are another example of an area where it's important to think about what problem you're trying to solve and prioritizing. We did some work a couple years ago looking at ADU financing models around the country. And I think the exciting thing about ADUs is that they can be a strategy for racial wealth gap, for preservation for people, I think you talked about, who are asset rich but cash poor. It's a way to stay in their homes. Sometimes their house is undervalued in the market because they don't have the resources to renovate it up to, and so it can be a source of cash flow. It can be an income stream. It can be, we just talked about multi-generational housing. But each of those is different. And one of the things that we've seen in some of the initial programs, because it's a really nascent field, is they're trying to tackle, and then you see a neighborhood of opportunity play, sometimes a voucher play, sometimes an affordable housing play. And the ones that we've seen that have maybe not notched as big an impact or numbers is because I think I would argue, they're trying to do too many things at once. And I think that we have so many problems, and our takeaway is, hard as it is, pick one thing to focus on and make your program about that. If it's a voucher play, then say you don't care about the incomes, you're not going to do the compliance, you're just going to take vouchers, and you're going to do it to white homeowners in high income areas and just accept vouchers. But I think that we have seen, and a lot of this, with all due respect to philanthropy, is coming from the funders behind it, are trying to layer too many things on it, and you're not seeing the demand.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm being given the signal that we're down to our last minute here. I'm going to try to do two things quickly. I'm actually going to come and give you the last word. Somebody had asked if we could talk a little bit more about new markets for homeownership. I'll just say one or two sentences more. For those of you that know the alphabet soup of new markets tax credits, the way that it works is that the developers themselves are the qualic Bs, the qualified active low income community businesses. So we vet and qualify our nonprofit developer members of single family affordable homes for home ownership. They then receive, it's a very competitive process, and again, we have much more demand than we have availability of credits. We then provide the very deep subsidy that the tax credit provides to finance their pipeline, and they in turn use that subsidy quite flexibly. For example, they could use it to bring down their own development costs to try to make sure they can deliver a home to market or deliver a renovated home that already existed at a lower cost. Some of them also use it for down payment assistance in the form typically of a soft second mortgage, right, to try to increase the accessibility or decrease the barriers for the actual homeowner to get into the home, and et cetera. But just two kind of additional key details. We access the credit, and it's eligible as a use for home ownership because of the developers that are getting the benefit of the credit, and then the subsidy itself can be used very flexibly to try to create affordable home ownership. Okay, so this one is called Navigating State Politics. We applaud the administration for urging Congress to push forth affordable housing policies nationally. Unfortunately, we're seeing more conservative state legislators pushing through language that will block affordable housing tax cuts for developers. For example, have you considered, has the White House considered, has this administration considered urging Congress to allow for a balance between affordable and market rate? So this is a little bit of the tension between federal and state, but why don't you give us one more minute and then we'll close the panel.
It's an interesting question. I'm quite moved by this point about focus and prioritizing, and there are so many challenges we need to solve in the housing market right now, among them that we just have lack of supply overall. I think as we think about what is the role of government in this space, it is a reasonable and rational thing to say, We have rental goals, we have homeownership goals, but we're going to start by focusing at the bottom end of the market. We're going to start by focusing on the rental side at making sure the lowest income renters have access to housing that is affordable and safe. On the homeownership side, we're going to do everything we can to get folks who've been locked out of homeownership, their families have been locked out of homeownership, into homeownership opportunities. So from the administration standpoint, we're all for affordable, we're all for market rate. We want to do anything we can to make it possible. But the reason we're starting with a focus on affordability and the lower end of the market is because we see that that is where we kind of have this crying out need right now that is even more extreme than it's been in the past several years.
Great. I like closing with that. Figure out what the particular problem is that you're trying to solve or the outcome that you're trying to reach, and then let your strategy sort of drive you from that way. I hope you'll join me in thanking Clemente and Priya and Daniel for their expertise and their time today. Thank all of you so much. We're gonna pause for just a minute, and I'm gonna introduce Andy Rumbach from Urban, who's going to bring up the second panel onto the stage. He's gonna follow me as their moderator. Andy is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and he co-leads the Climate and Communities Practice area at Urban as a mixed methods researcher, whose focus is on risks to climate change and government roles in climate mitigation. Andy is also a former professor of urban planning and studies the impact of disaster events on affordable housing and land use policy. So I'll welcome Andrew and his panel to the stage. Thank you all.
Thought maybe Andy had quit. We're stuck here without
Quick costume change.
Wow, it's right up there.
Well, thank you so much. That was a fantastic first panel. My wrist is worn out from taking notes and new questions and things to look at later. So I'm Andy Rumbach. I'm a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute, relatively new, coming from Texas A&M University, and I do research on disasters and climate change. And I help lead a group here, along with Sarah McTarnahan, Climate and Communities in Metro, that focuses on the impact of climate, natural hazards, disasters on people and communities. So this is a wonderful panel to be part of. I'm excited to help lead off by giving a little bit of framing from a research perspective. So we know that it's a vital time right now to be focused on the intersection of housing and climate resilience. At the top of our minds, I think, are events like the recent Buffalo blizzard, terrible impact on our communities, and we know that these events are becoming more frequent and severe due to climate change. And we've had some really optimistic news recently with the IPCC report that came out showing that maybe we're going to achieve a little bit less warming than we thought. We have fantastic policy coming out that's going to focus on clean energy, but we know no matter what we do, climate change is going to be a major challenge today and in the future, especially when it comes to housing. And this is these problems are especially important for households of color. And as a researcher, decades of research, careful research in many different parts of the United States shows one fact that is firmly grounded and proved again and again, and that is that households of color tend to be more vulnerable to the types of disasters and climate events that we expect to see more of. They tend to be exposed at a higher rate to these kind of hazards. They tend to be less prepared because of the kinds of racial wealth gaps we see, not only with individuals, but also in communities. They tend to struggle afterwards with recovery. And so this is something, again, we see again and again, and it's terribly important that we address within our public policy and practice spaces. And we know that climate change is accelerating all of those trends. And so that really calls for new innovations in the way that we think about planning for building, maintaining housing in our communities. And so that's where the good news for me, I think, really starts. Resilience has become part of the popular lexicon. People from across all different sectors are talking about climate and resilience, not just a narrow group of folks who traditionally were focused on things like disasters and emergency management. We also have these, like I said, historic levels of funding that are coming from the federal government, but also along with that, and crucially important, a focus on environmental justice and addressing some of these historic wrongs that have led to the situation that we're in. So when it comes to building climate resilient housing, I think that myself and many others who look at this from a research perspective think that we need to put everything on the table. How we plan for housing, how we build it, the technologies we use, the kinds of policies we pass. And so that's a really daunting task, but luckily we have 4 panelists who are actually doing the work out there in the world and that who we can learn from. So starting with Duan Andrade, who is the Executive Director of Solar and Energy Loan Fund. We have Sarah Berger, who is the the Director of Sustainability for Push Buffalo, which stands for People United for Sustainable Housing. We have Nick Mitchell-Bennett, who is the Executive Director of Come Dream, Come Build in Texas, where I also live in Central Texas. And then finally, we have Mihir Parikh, who is the Program Director and leader of the Climate Resilience Academies at Enterprise. So I'd like to start with you here. If you could talk about the sort of national portrait of what's happening here, the intersection between climate and housing, and especially for the affordable housing stock. What is Enterprise seeing out there? What are the kinds of trends, opportunities, challenges that we're seeing across the country?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Andy. Great to be with you all, and really honored to be here with my fellow panelists who are doing really, really great work on the ground as well. So Enterprise Community Partners, for those of you who don't know, national nonprofit, just celebrated 40 years. We're focused on affordable housing through increasing the housing supply of affordable housing, advancing racial equity, and building resilience and upward mobility. So we focus on every state, have presence in every state in the country as well as our territories, and do this through 3 different ways. So one is by aggregating and investing capital back into communities through our CDFI, building and managing properties ourselves, and then through solutions, programmatic solutions and policy solutions, and that's sort of where I sit in Enterprise. So in terms of your question and sort of like what are we seeing from a national level and what's the challenge really, I think of 2 things. One is that, and I should also mention that Enterprise mainly focuses on multifamily rental housing, but also rural tribal housing as well. So one is that we have an aging building stock that, as the climate is rapidly changing, as you mentioned, just can't withstand these more frequent, intense impacts from the changing climate, which is obviously a big problem. So how do we prepare that current building stock as well as new building stock coming into the market for these more intense storms, wildfires, winds, whatever it might be? And then I think the other thing, going back to the climate problem and exacerbating climate problems, are we need to currently decarbonize our current building stock to not exacerbate these problems in climate and a rapidly changing climate that we're already seeing already. I think it was you or maybe the previous panel mentioned, that we at Enterprise call the sort of effects from climate change on the affordable housing sector as a threat multiplier. So as the climate is drastically changing going forward, that's only exacerbating the housing and the affordable housing crisis at that. So at Enterprise, what we're doing, to answer your question, is approaching it in 3 different ways. And that's through really focusing on adaptation, mitigation, and recovery as well. So on the mitigation side, our Green Enterprise Green Communities program, which is our longest running climate program, is the only green building certification program in the country. So certification and standards on when you're looking at particularly multifamily affordable housing, what are certain standards through electrification, sustainability, health that you should be incorporating into the new development and new construction as well as major retrofits. We're also launching a equitable decarbonization program, looking at decarbonizing existing building stock, especially in areas that might not be as well poised to do so. So doing that through creating listening sessions on the ground in a lot of the regions that we work in, to then create a funding database and an information hub, just because there's so much out there on decarbonization and electrification right now. It's kind of a lot to grasp how to do it, how to approach it, where to go for funding to do so. And then the third, in terms of resilience and adaptation, are our climate resilience academies that we launched in the end of 2021. And so that is basically providing education and technical assistance through different regions that Enterprise works in nationally to directly partner with owners and operators of multifamily affordable housing on how to adapt to the changing climate, how to increase resilience within their properties, how to work with residents on disaster preparedness, and also, again, approach this issue of funding and financing, which I can sense is the common theme beyond housing and climate that we're talking about today. So those are kind of some of the things that we're doing.
Great, thank you. And I'll say what really resonates with me is talking about the existing housing stock. One of my areas of research the last 5 or 6 years has really been on understanding mobile home parks and the impact of climate hazards on mobile home parks. And during, we saw earlier this graph of this huge boom in manufactured housing in the 1970s. Well, those homes are still out there, and those homes are especially vulnerable. And what we do about that is such a critical question for many communities of color. So thank you. So we know that it's great to look at the national picture, but something we know is that resilience really happens at the local level, right? Resilience means something very different in Washington, D.C., or in central Texas where I live, or in rural Mississippi, or wherever else. And so I'd like to invite the rest of the panel to talk about the work that you're doing in the places that you are. So what does resilience mean in the places that you're working, and how are you working to build resilience in the housing that you're interacting with? So we'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here and having this wonderful, rich conversation. I am Duan Andrade. I'm the Executive Director of the Solar and Energy Loan Fund. We're based in Florida, but we operate across the Southeast. So we have a footprint in Alabama, South Carolina, soon Tennessee, Georgia, and a few partners in Texas. We're a nonprofit CDFI and also a green bank. We've been around for 13 years now. And really, we were born as a green CDFI, meaning that we intentionally set up a mechanism to provide affordable and accessible financing to LMI homeowners to be able to make climate resilient and clean energy upgrades. Then we moved into helping landlords of multifamily access affordable capital, unsecured, based on cash flows and ability to repay, not on credit scores, to ensure that financing was accessible. And then most recently, with the help of JPMorgan Chase, we launched a program for new developers focused on BIPOC and LMI novice developers. So that being said, this concept of resiliency being a part of the conversation is really great, because we've been doing it since 2014, basically, where we expanded the scope of our work to include resiliency, which really is a fancy word for basic upgrades like roofs, impact windows, doors, hurricane shutters, which are an absolutely necessary step to take before we even think about decarbonizing in that, pure sense of solar and renewable energy. We realize working in our markets, speaking of, how it's place-based, that we had to address the issues of heat in Florida and the Southeast. So the Southeast has, the majority of the most climate vulnerable states. And in those vulnerable zones, most of the population is LMI and Black and Hispanic and low income. So, already those populations are paying more for energy, for access to capital, for housing. They live in older stock homes, to your point. So we realized that what we really needed to do was address the problem holistically. So we created this triple bottom line impact model where we're constantly and intentionally looking at how to address the social justice, the economic justice, and the environmental justice in one. So our programs really are focusing on unlocking capital to achieve higher standards of resilience, safety, health in the homes, and that ability and preparedness to go solar as the last step, at least in the Southeast. So basically, I mean, the Southeast is really constantly left behind in the context of funding at a national scale. So we are really intentionally focused on bringing capital and solutions and programs that work for LMI communities there.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks. This is a great day to be here with all of you, and I love all the stuff that we're talking about and all the breadth of the last panel and everything that was there. It's fantastic. Talking about new markets tax credits and homeownership and sustainable stuff, and we're missing one thing. We haven't mentioned the word rural since we walked in the room. So I just wanted to bring everybody's attention to the fact that a lot of our country is rural, and a lot of the people who live in it are also Black and brown people that live in the rural areas. And we just remember that all of these things going on are also happening in rural America. And sustainability is definitely one of them. And it's also a great day when Priya and I can have a conversation. We're not even saying hi to each other yet, but we're still having our conversations throughout the day, which is awesome. And I agree with you. I'm going to try the shared homeownership thing. We'll see how it goes. And to the last conversation before we came up here was on the focus and what we're doing. The reason we're doing this is it's the sustainable and the green building and all of that other thing is our focus is raising wealth and increasing wealth for homeowners and for renters and for students and for business owners in our community. So the reason that we have tried everything under the sun to figure out how to make a house, whether you own it or rent it, less expensive and less of a drag on your life under the sun when it comes to green building and sustainability and whatever the cool term is right now, is to put more money in the pockets of the people that we are serving. I live in a persistent poverty location along the U.S.-Mexico border. Brownsville, Texas is the part of the map when you're watching the news that's cut off. Okay, so we don't even get our weather anymore. 1/3 of the country of Mexico is north of us. We are 35, 37%, depending on what year, poverty, federal poverty in our area. So how do we increase the access to wealth and the wealth growing? And so by building these things that Ms. Andrade is talking about into our homes is going to bring that wealth. So that's why we do it. We've tried everything. I mean, we run a school and housing counseling, and we build 150 houses a year, whether it be for single family, multifamily. Single family home ownership is our the big thing that we do. Subdivision development. The newest thing that we're doing now is a home ownership project which we call Mi Casita, and partnering with Building Community Workshop, which is a nonprofit design firm. And now our newest partner on that is TEPRI, and trying to figure out how we build volumetric modular housing in a factory site, which we call the farm. Factory is such a big word, and it sounds so much more than it is. It's a shed with these guys that are building a house. They're doing it really, really fast, and for 25% less than with stick built. And so at the farm, they're building these houses, and we're now, we're working to put solar panels on them, and they meet all the, it's enterprise green communities where we've pushed enterprise green communities to think more about home ownership and single family housing and not just rental housing, and that's working well. So it's anything we can do to lower that cost and make that house more affordable and wealth building. And so when you're not I just looked at numbers yesterday in my hotel room here, both single-family home ownership numbers and our rental numbers on the cost of insurance. So our insurance at one of our multifamily sites last year went up 40%. This thing's not cash flowing. Don't tell my investors that right now. Okay, but it's not cash flowing because of the interest. I mean, because of the insurance. And that insurance, though, we're looking at, what is that insurance about? Where is it? Oh, wait, it's wind and hail. It's hurricane insurance. It's flooding insurance. We're not in a flood zone. Well, wait a minute. Everything in the Rio Grande Valley is in a flood zone. It's just how bad is it, right? And so we're sucking money out of both our pockets as well as the renters as well as the home buyers. So this touches all of our lives, and the fact that it's like, hey, let's do this now. It's like, really, government? I don't care who's running it. This should have been done a long time ago. If it's just about economics, it's not about yes, I want to save the planet. I want my grandchildren and great grandchildren and whoever to enjoy this place, but I also like my neighbor to be able to buy milk. And to do that is to lower the cost of living in that house. And building this way will do that.
Sir?
Yep. So Push Buffalo is a member-led organization based in the west side of Buffalo. And we work at the intersection of climate, racial, and housing justice. And when we think about climate resilience in our area, it looks like being able to prepare our community to withstand major weather events, both known and unknown. We had the Buffalo blizzard that a lot of people heard about. Last month, we had an earthquake that woke us up at 6 a.m., and it wasn't something we were used to. A little shake, but still very startling, and I think it brings to mind the ever-changing landscape that we're kind of looking at. But resilience also looks like making sure people stay safe and healthy in their homes as the weather patterns change overall. So Buffalo's not known for its heat, but we're getting increasingly warmer summers and longer heat waves. And so when we're thinking about climate resilience, it's just one facet of addressing the climate crisis. And I think one of the things that my fellow panelists are doing a great job at noting is that when we're building our homes more sustainably and we can make sure that people are retaining as much wealth as possible, that helps them prepare for major weather events. Like for this blizzard that we had, a lot of people couldn't afford to go out and buy 3 days worth of groceries to prepare to be shut down in their homes. And then we also know that low income and communities of color recover much slower from major weather events, and in some cases don't ever recover to the same level that they were at before. And so climate resilience, it looks like a lot of different things. And so what we're kind of doing to address resilient home ownership, Push isn't a reactive organization, but we react to the changes in the world that we're looking at. And so the first iteration of making sure we had resilient home ownership in the west side of Buffalo actually looked like going and land banking and buying vacant homes to prevent them from being sold for development and flipping, as well as out-of-town slumlords in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. And that was kind of the first iteration. And then the next iteration is a program we have called Warm and Dry, where we want residents and homeowners in existing homes to stay in their homes and to be safe. And so Warm and Dry offers funding for critical home repair, such as roofs, foundation, and sewer lines, to help keep people in their homes, but also as a step towards weatherization and rooftop solar. And then our next big thing that we're so excited about is our first-time home ownership program, where we're gonna take vacant duplexes and we're gonna renovate them to be high-efficiency, all-electric homes with rooftop solar. They're gonna have a robust building envelope, which means great insulation, reduced drafts, so that people, when we do have the power outages that we'll probably face, the homes retain heat for longer, and that keeps people safer. And then they're also all duplexes. And so what that does is that gives an opportunity for some wealth building, but it also adds an affordable rental onto the market, which we're very excited about.
Great, thank you. And that's a perfect segue into our next question. I think throughout the day we've been talking about, in different ways, the intersection of the market that largely drives the realities that we face in terms of affordable housing. And in this panel, the market and affordability, but where it meets climate resilience. And so I'd like to have you each reflect a little bit on what are some of the benefits and I think all of you have started to speak to these already, of a resilience focus within building affordable housing, but also what are some of the challenges or some of the tensions? We know that sometimes, for example, upfront costs can make affordability more challenging, at least to pencil out in the near term. So maybe we'll start go the other direction, start down there and come this way.
Sure. And I guess first and foremost, I just want to recognize that like the challenge part of it has been around for a while. Right? Yeah. This isn't new. This isn't new news. It's not a new issue. It maybe looks different now than it was 50, 20 years ago. And I think also the pace of innovation and willingness to act has sped up, which is obviously a great thing. But the challenge isn't new, and people who have been working to address the challenge have also been doing it in the shadows, let's say, for a long time. So I just want to address that first and foremost, and especially in places that not just brown and black and low-income communities in urban areas, but to Nick's point, I mean, rural, tribal, right? Like we haven't mentioned tribal communities at all today. So with that said, I think, can you remind me of the question again? Sorry, I went off.
So how is Enterprise thinking about leveraging the intersection of housing and resilience, and what are some of the key pain points, or however you want to put it?
Yeah, okay. So I remember why I went off on that rant. So my point is that I think at least now, I mean, we're thinking about climate issues as housing issues and housing issues as climate issues. And I think just that switch, whenever it happened, is crucial to actually working towards solving the problem. I think some of the challenges that we're seeing, that I'm seeing, because we have this urgency to decarbonize, like lower emissions on one level, and also adapt at a really fast level to all these unpredictable climate events, and we have this new willingness to push and to create better policy to address that, I think at least from Enterprise's standpoint with affordable housing multifamily owner and operators, it's tough. There's so much out there right now on what you should be doing, resources and funding, which are two really good things, but it's especially for lower capacity, smaller organizations who don't either have the staff to prepare or maybe don't have the education and the wherewithal on these issues. It's a daunting task to say, oh, if I'm in New York City and there's Local Law 97, which is going to require me to electrify my building stock by 2035, I think, and then also I'm looking at climate projections on the First Street Foundation just came out with a new report last week on how hurricanes and hurricane force winds are going to be creeping further north, all the way to the northeast in the upcoming years. So if I have to think about that, right, and I'm looking at my capital stack of making improvements to my building, do I have to choose between windproofing my building and electrifying my building? Again, it's great that we have this forward-thinking policy now and resources and money out there to do it, but I think one challenge is that it's a lot. And so to the point I think Priya was mentioning on the last panel about like picking one thing is good if the policy dictates or the law dictates that you have to do something by a certain point. It's a lot to bite off and chew at one instance. And then the other thing I think Nick already brought up is insurance. I mean, everywhere, especially in the Southeast where Duan is, but everywhere, right? And so as a owner and an operator with mainly renters of an LMI population, I mean, you have to choose between raising your rents on people who you don't want to raise rents on and paying your insurance premium. And also if you're in a state like Louisiana or Florida, insurance companies are also just straight up leaving the state and not even providing hurricane wind hail insurance anymore. So I think those two things. And then also as we're in this electrification, decarbonization push, making sure that basic energy efficiency and weatherization is not left behind. I'll stop there.
So I think we've spoken about a lot of the benefits of resilience in terms of like reduction in energy burden, as well as just passive survivability during major weather events. But, you know, I think a lot of the major challenges that we're facing, you know, when we're working on these projects, we do want to address a lot of issues. And, you know, part of the reason is because we have to address all of these issues. And we're at a point in time that, you know, we've kind of kicked the can down the road for a really long time. And so, you know, we need to be able to address multiple things in one action. So challenges we're kind of facing, you know, cost is always a challenge. I think when we're talking about innovative building strategies, bringing workforce along is really important, and making sure that we have workforce development that benefits our community members. But workforce is also a challenge because, you know, if we're talking about building this really, you know, unique building envelope to keep our homes as warm or cool as possible, like the labor force doesn't have that knowledge. And so even if, you know, it might not be incredibly more expensive material wise, we actually pay an additional cost just because it's a new thing. And so we really have to focus on how we can kind of integrate these changes into the common building market so that we can start reducing these costs so that we can grow these programs. And then I think another major challenge is power outages and staying resilient during power outages. You know, in New York State right now, we passed a really ambitious climate law in 2019, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which did a lot of things. One of it mandated a timeline for us to get off of fossil fuels in New York State. And right now we're in the process of implementing that and creating all of these pieces of legislation where we said we were going to do the thing. Now, how do we actually do the thing? And now we're fighting a huge fossil fuel lobby, putting out all these false narratives and false solutions, and it's making the way into the community, and it's terrifying people. And so, you know, when we're talking about decarbonizing buildings, like that's so important both for the planet, but also for people's health. You know, when you're combusting methane, sometimes called natural gas in your home, you're breathing in nitrogen dioxide, you're breathing in carbon monoxide, and we're, you know, really damaging our health. But people right now believe that if you have methane gas heat in your home, you're more likely to have heat during a power outage, which isn't true. And so that's been a new barrier for us. And then an additional barrier is just the cost of technology. So battery storage is a great option for resilience. And if you pair it with rooftop solar, you know, you can use some of the excess solar energy that you generate to feed that battery. But battery storage is so expensive right now that even when we try to create a project that we can integrate battery storage in, we just can't figure out a way to fund it. But if people don't see it as an example in affordable housing in communities of color, they don't think it's a possibility. And so how do we kind of bridge that gap and seed the technology in the neighborhoods that it needs to be in? I think I'll leave it at that.
Great. So some of the things that we are doing in the, you know, I've said the reason that we're doing them. When you take the option of buying and owning your first home, in our case, a lot of times it's not their first home, that they're just moving from a dilapidated shack into something that actually is not leaking like a sieve and is warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And so moving into this new item is, in this new house, is not so much about just becoming sustainable or green, right? It's also about being able to be a homeowner, being able to afford the products that's there. So as we built Mi Casita, we weren't just thinking about one thing. We had to think about all of the things that impact. And so climate change and its effect on our buyers was part of it. So as we created the Mi Casita, so, you know, moving from site built, stick built to, you know, to the farm setting or the factory setting, that's already becomes more sustainable, right? It's a greener approach to building a house because there's way less waste. And that less waste is there because I'm always there going, that cost me too much money, that pile of trash right there. Let's put it, so, there's less waste. We're actually putting solar panels on the factory, on the farm, right? And, what that's going to save, we don't know yet, but we're excited to see what that's about. And then just building the little bit that goes, these houses start at 578 square feet and go up to 1,400. So we're not talking about the Taj Mahal here, right? So what little things can we put in here? We have water in the Southwest is an issue. So, water sense. And, and if you start adding these little things in, then it equals up to something bigger than each of them. So that is exciting, as well as like teaching. We run a job training program, so our students are at the farm learning to build in this green, sustainable way, because we're making little proselytes out there, and they're going to go out there and they're going to evangelize the world. Tomorrow's builders are being trained today with us. So all of these little things that go in there, and the fact each family can choose the way their home's going to be built and going to be put together. We working with BC Workshop in our website designer. People get to go through our website and design their home one piece at a time, and the resilience is put into those decisions, and the resilience pieces, and our buyers are not. Everybody says that low income folks can't do this and they can't do that because it just costs too much and it's just too hard. So we're going to build it into the process. So at the end, the mortgage covers it all, right? Instead of having to retrofit, right? Yeah. The retrofit is, I get it, we got to do it. These guys are just like awesome women for doing this kind of thing. I'm kind of wimpy, so let's do it on the front end and get it all funded by Freddie and Fannie. And if they don't, or if the banks don't, then that's where we need to start legislating this stuff and saying, you know what, yes, you need to do this. The retrofit thing is just costing too much money. So the solar that's going on all our houses is going to be part of the mortgage, period. Right. And it's like, well, can low-income people do that? Do they want to do that? Of course they want to do it. Of course they want to do it. They're poor. They're not stupid.
Yes.
Right? And so give them the opportunity to make that choice and be a part of it and make it somewhat affordable to join in. Then the 70% of the CO2s that created in this country by residential houses, they're not the problem. Because they get enough people pointing fingers at them that they're the problem in this country. So let's just take that off the table. But building little pieces into it makes it big.
Well, I'm going to start with the intersection of climate and resiliency and what we see. In the Southeast, we see a lot of climate gentrification, right? So communities being displaced from their kind of poor areas that nobody cared about for so long, and now are the only higher ridge areas, like in Florida. So now all developers want to come in, buy them out, and displace them. What does a low-income resident do when they get an offer for a cash buyout with an amount of money that they've never in their life seen before at once, right? So one of the biggest challenges is, how do we keep that generational wealth in the hands of those people who have it today? Because the minute they sell out, they're not going to be able to afford another home, period, or they have to move into smaller rental homes that are lower quality. So I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have in the South and the Southeast is addressing the older stock home in areas that now have suddenly become very attractive for developers of higher end housing. So how do we keep those communities there? How do we help them thrive? And how, obviously, do we help them build the climate resiliency so that they can sustain the impacts and, of course, also endure the insurance costs, for example? I mean, this is incredible. Every year, the same day that hurricane season is announced, June 1st, the same day insurance companies drop about 50,000 people, most of them low and moderate income. So, it's like, well, what do we do? So I think that one of the things that we are intentionally focused on is ensuring that people can stay in their homes, those who already have homes. So our single-family home program provides this unsecured loans based on ability to repay. We give credit to people with 0 credit scores, make sure the credit is affordable, and we walk them through the whole process, the project management. We pair them up with a contractor that's been pre-vetted, pre-approved. We make sure the project gets done to code, so there's lots of consumer protection. And in that whole process, we also advance financial inclusion for them. So it's a win-win-win for them. So that being said, I think that the barriers are still huge. Well, cost everybody's talked about. So what I encounter often is that developers moving from single-family homeowners to landlords to this new program that we're setting up for new developers, novice, Black and brown, female-led development projects. We find that there is lack of knowledge, lack of access to training and knowledge to become developers of affordable housing in communities by community members so that we can preserve communities and build with resiliency features embedded in it, like Nick here was saying, and even solar. And what we hear from the bigger established developers is constantly, oh, those bells and whistles cost too much. So the first thing we have to do is stop calling these things bells and whistles, because they're not bells and whistles, right? That's a huge challenge that we have in the South. Second thing is, or maybe first thing really, is policy, lack of policy. We don't have any policy that incentivizes, renewable energy or resiliency. I mean, this is stuff that we're having to take on our own. So policy is huge, but you can't just impose policy and say, okay, like insurance companies, you have to now have a new higher code fortified roof, and if not, I'm going to drop you. Well, then what's the solution? So policy is a huge thing. And I think that the other thing is that we still don't have the right type of capital flowing into both rehabs and new construction that encompasses this resiliency, which we have to demystify. It cannot still be something talked about as something separate from building. It should be already embedded in all building practices, right? But while that happens, for example, LIHTC. LIHTC is only available for large-scale, development. We need something similar for smaller scale, mid-sized development that will fill in neighborhoods with affordable housing, whether it's for homeownership or for rental, that is led by community members so they are not displaced. In a way that it's resilient, that is affordable from the operating costs, that can have solar, that can have air conditioning, that all of that helps them stay there. So I think that the last thing I want to say is that there's not enough attention in the small to mid-size development opportunities. There are huge gaps in the market. It's all like huge development or nothing, or small. So how do we scale small to mid-size development to fill in all those all those lots that are everywhere that cannot be developed because of lack of access to capital and lack of access to knowledge to do that?
Thank you. And so we have just a few minutes before audience questions, and I would encourage anyone here or watching online to submit your questions to the panel. And so this is a final question. I don't expect all of you to respond, but if you would like to respond, please do, because it's about this very new source of funding that is coming online, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. Obviously, a generational infusion of capital into many parts of our economy, but including housing. And with capital and money comes challenges like climate gentrification. So I would just ask you, how are you thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act? What are you most optimistic about? And then maybe, if you were crowned leader for the day, if you had a wish for your communities, and especially for supporting communities of color that are trying to build climate resilient housing, what is something that you hope that the IRA does as these programs get figured out?
King for a day? You don't want me to answer.
Do you want to go
So who would like to take that on?
I'll jump on this. I think this is great. I think it's wonderful. I'm so excited. I'll believe it when I see it. I'm in a market very much like Florida, where, I can't imagine our state legislature saying, hey, let's make this a rule about anything. Well, I can think of a few things they make rules about, but anyway. But I'm excited about it. I think it's like, por fin, that we're making an advancement and putting funding where it needs to go. However, I've sat in many, many meetings like this where I've had some of the secondary market mortgage purchasers talk to me about their sustainable green mortgage product. Has anybody out there ever been able to sell a green mortgage product? They don't exist. They're like a unicorn. I believe in unicorns, by the way, but I've not seen one yet. So I've been told. So it's very much like this money. It's like it's maybe going to come, But in the meantime, we're trying to build products and systems, all of us up here, that can survive without them. Because we have to, especially in places where a lot of us live. It's just, I don't want to do that. I would love to have the subsidy come, because I agree there are a few things in this world that doesn't need subsidy, and a few that do. Education, healthcare, and affordable housing, whether it's home ownership, and like Priya said today, or rental, needs to have the subsidy. It's all of a sudden 2023, and we're talking about now building in the sustainable part of it. Excited. I will believe it when it's here.
Can I jump in? You were supposed to be optimistic.
I'm just sunshine. They call me happiness.
I'm going to be optimistic because that's my nature. Whether it comes or not, we're of the idea that if you're not going to help us, stay out of our way. We'll circumvent whatever. But let's say it comes our way, right? So I think a couple of things are really, really exciting and something that we're working on and thinking about a lot. It is two things. One is the fact that for once, finally, there's a 40%, at least a 40% of these funds earmarked for LMI disadvantaged communities. Thank you, finally, because 40% of Americans fall into the LMI category. So I think that is huge. It means that we will be really able to use the funds for the markets that need it the most. It's going to be up to us to create these programs without adding cost barriers and other barriers. We have to be the ones facilitating this. So the second thing that I'm really excited about, that I think is going to be a game changer if we're able to get these funds lined up and channel through to grassroots organizations and intermediaries of all sorts and colors and sizes, is the solar piece. So there is the ITC, the tax credit for solar has been extended 30%. But we all know that this tax credit has not been available to low and moderate income because they don't pay enough taxes to gain access to the tax credit. So that's like the direct pay. Now, the direct pay was supposed to go directly to LMI homeowners, but they missed that and they went right to, organizations, but it's going to go to nonprofit organizations and schools and others. So I think we need to be ready as nonprofits to think about how we're going to use our nonprofit status and reach and whatever to capture the direct pay. It's a 30% that we can pass on to LMI households to be able to adopt solar in a way that financially makes sense. So that, for us, is what we are preparing and thinking about.
Yeah, happy to. I would echo, and I guess I'll do the combination of Mr. Sunshine and Miss Optimist over here. I mean, it's amazing, right? Like you said, Andy, I mean, biggest injection of climate-related funding, $27 billion for EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, all this, amazing. And I'm so thankful. For enterprise, I mean, probably the biggest thing we're keeping an eye out on is HUD's Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. $1 billion, it's going to go quick. Sounds like a lot. It is a lot historically, but it's going to go quick. So I think mainly, what's on my mind is, I think, echoing what Duan was just speaking of, making sure it's getting to the people that it is intended to get to, because it's coming fast, and it's going to go fast, And organizations that it needs to get to are not prepared from a staff capacity standpoint, right? From a grants management standpoint. So I think we as intermediaries, we as nonprofits on the ground, all other intermediaries and nonprofits and enterprises on plenty of like working group calls with our partners like NHT and others to have conversations with the federal agencies as they're creating their regulations and rules about how this funding actually gets deployed to say lower barriers to entry for these programs because otherwise it's not going to go to who it is intended to go to. And that's my biggest worry. But I'm really thankful.
Great. Well, let's turn to audience questions. The first question is for Sarah. And I love this question. I'm married to a historic preservationist, so this speaks directly to my heart. So I rarely hear talked about in the same conversation the connection between historic preservation, deconstruction and reclamation with decarbonization, resiliency, and affordability. I'm a historic window restoration apprentice and work in the affordable housing field. People often think new windows equal energy efficiency, and that's not always the case because old windows can be made efficient and you can keep old high-quality materials out of the landfill. How can we better merge these areas?
Sure. I think this is a great question. I actually, in the earlier part of my career, cut my teeth on doing green building certifications with Enterprise Green Communities. And a lot of those projects were actually historic tax credit projects that were combined with LIHTC projects. And so I think, especially thinking about Buffalo, we were in an industrial city. We have a significant amount of underutilized buildings that were built stronger than we would ever build anything now. I think it's really hard to argue that new construction can kind of compare to some of this historic construction that we've done in the past. And so I think it's really important that we're making sure we address both new construction, but also utilizing our existing materials to reduce the embodied carbon that our buildings have. That being said, I think there are some really complicated things when it comes to retrofitting a historic building to be decarbonized, energy efficient, and resilient. And some of those that come to mind, the first thing is really nerdy, but especially when you have masonry buildings, they're really strong buildings, but it's very expensive to insulate and air seal them correctly. And so I think it's really important for programs that are encouraging this financially, that they make sure that they fund making sure that we install the new building envelope correctly behind that brick facade, and not giving exemptions for historic buildings. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing that needs to be balanced is, we had a project, School 77. It's a historic tax credit and LIHTC project. It's a school that was renovated with community input. There's 30 senior apartments, and then we have our offices and some other nonprofit offices on the first floor. And we wanted to maximize the rooftop solar. But because it was a historic tax credit project, we had to make sure that you couldn't see those solar panels from the ground. And, I kind of understand it from one perspective, but from another perspective, it seems a little bit silly that we had to exchange clean energy generation for an aesthetic choice. And so I think for those historic tax credit people, I think it's really important to pick your priorities and pick what we're gonna allow to change. Because yes, these are beautiful buildings and we want them to resemble and honor the past, but we want to bring them into the future. And so they're not gonna look the exact same.
Great, thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, so I'm actually going to ask two questions and allow, because I think several of you might want to jump in and give very succinct answers. So the first has to do with community land trusts and climate gentrification. Is acquisition by community land trusts a feasible option to mitigate against address the climate gentrification, cash buyout for profit developers, preserve ongoing future options for intergenerational wealth building? So that's number one. Number two, and by the way, there's a ton of fantastic questions here that we're not going to be able to get to. How to make the deals pencil out. I think that's on everyone's mind in this room and on all the panels. We just heard in the first panel how difficult it is to make homeownership affordable without widespread subsidy. Can you discuss in more detail how you are making rehabs and sustainable and resilient construction pencil out in today's market? So I'm going to throw those two questions out there. Welcome your brevity in response.
I think anything that you do to make it to make it affordable is going to make it affordable. So whether it's a land trust or not, right? I mean, if that's what we're trying to do, then yes. And so, yeah, I mean, can they work? Yes, they can work, and they can bring that affordability. And if we're having to rob from Peter to pay Paul, which is what this community is always asked to do, then sure. But my question and my pushback is like, why can't we do both? Why are we always giving in? Why are we always having to say, it's going to be historic or it's going to be this? Why can we not do both? Our clients deserve the same thing that every person of means that they get. So I respect the question. It's black and white. Yes, I'm trying not to be, yes, you can and you should, and we need to figure out every which way that we can do it.
And I just want to address his point without answering the question directly. I think and it also goes back to something Dewan was saying earlier about preserving communities where they are, right? Like, we need to do a better job of storytelling, number one, and recognizing that culture and community culture is a big part of this conversation when we're talking about preparing for a changing climate, right? Displacement, I mean, I'm not going to touch relocation or anything like that right now, but, and breaking the cycle of recovery, right? We're talking about resilience. What about mental resilience, right? I mean, we're asking these communities to be resilient time and time again. I mean, go to Florida, go to New Orleans, go to anywhere that gets hit by disasters time and time again, and ask them to keep being resilient from an emotional, social, mental standpoint, right? So that's, I think, just to your point, Nick, meet people where they're at and recognize that it's not that black and white.
I want to just add to, I want to answer the question a little bit is, do community land trusts, can they help with the gentrification? And I think that in our case in Florida, definitely, because the land trust model are supported by local governments widely, and they get access to lots of free things that others don't. So again, the philosophy is whatever it takes to do it, we need to do it. So there has to be land trust models, yes. It's a great tool. We only were able to finance land trust projects with the help of JP Morgan Chase Pro Neighborhood Grant funding, because you can't really use private market capital because the deals don't pencil out, because they're deep affordability. But there's deep affordability, but there's also that middle, that missing middle that gets left out, right? Which is the people that are working class Americans, frontline workers that aren't poor enough to have access to the really deep low-income housing, are not rich enough to access regular market. So I think we have to be intentional in choosing where we're going to focus our energy and say, okay, who's good at doing land trusts? Good. Let them do it, and we'll help them with the resiliency piece and the other stuff. We want to serve this missing middle, and then the rest let the market take care of. So, but I think it is a viable, an important part of the solution.
Great. Well, I'm getting the 1 minute sign, so I have the honor of closing out today's event. So I would like to express my gratitude on behalf of the Urban Institute to all of our speakers from today, our presenters and panelists, and from me, our amazing technical staff that helps put on these events in such style. So as Christopher stressed in his opening remarks, the challenges and urgency of this moment cannot be overstated. The fragile nature of the housing market, the role of structural racism, as we've talked about throughout both panels, and the mounting threat of climate change poses to stable and affordable homeownership, and especially for households of color. And so now is the time to take action and innovation and to make investments to turn the tide. And we've heard from panelists who are actually doing this work on a day-to-day basis. I hope that everyone is taking away inspiration, but also practical knowledge that they can use in their own work, and that we can continue to have these conversations into the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.